The sun burned white over White Mesa, the kind of desert heat that stripped the land down to bone and memory. Rocks glowed like embers, and the wind carried whispers of dust, old sins, and the scent of dry mesquite. A lone figure moved through the shimmer of the horizon, tall, lean, and shadowed by a cavalry-issued Stetson that hadn't left his head in a decade. Ethan Hawk Riley rode his battered bay gelding in a slow, deliberate pace, as though the horse, like him, knew there was no need to rush through an empty world. Every creak of the saddle sounded like a confession, leather groaning against the weight of a man who had seen too much, done too much, and would rather forget than remember. At 42, Ethan was carved from the same sun-bleached wood as the old fence posts he patched along the trail. His skin was tanned like worn leather, his jaw lined with days of stubble, his eyes a pale steel that hid more ghosts than they revealed. A revolver rested at his hip, polished by habit rather than pride, and a rifle was slung across his back, a reminder of the man he used to be. A soldier once, a cavalry rider in a war that had left too many graves unmarked. Some nights, when the wind moaned across the mesa, Ethan swore he could still hear the crackle of fire and the screams of children from that one day he never could forget, the day they burned the Apache village. He had stood there, young and proud, obeying orders he should have defied. He hadn't fired the torch himself, but his silence had been just as deadly. The memory festered like a thorn under skin, a wound prayer couldn't heal. Around his neck hung a small silver cross, blackened at the edges from years of dust and sun. He wasn't sure if God still listened to him, or if he ever had. Maybe the cross was just a weight, something to remind him that mercy was for better men. The land stretched endless around him, red canyon walls carved by time, scattered cactus like silent sentinels, and the jagged silhouette of the Sierra Blanca Mountains far to the east. Out here, a man had to make peace with loneliness or go mad. Ethan had chosen solitude long ago. It was safer that way, safer not to care. He nudged the horse forward, squinting beneath the brim of his hat. A line of black vultures circled far off, their wings cutting lazy arcs against the sky. That meant death was close, and in these lands, death never stayed quiet for long. By late afternoon, the sun dipped enough to cast long copper shadows across the canyon floor. Ethan dismounted near a trickle of water, hardly more than a muddy vein in the earth, and let his horse drink. He crouched, filling his own canteen, his hands calloused and scarred from years of rope, gunstock, and regret. When he rose, his gaze swept the horizon. The mesa was silent, but silence in this land was never empty. It pressed against the ears, sharp as a blade. Somewhere out there, beyond the ridges, there were whispers of cavalry patrols and outlaw gangs. He had heard the rumors in Dust Creek, a bounty placed on an Apache girl, a relic stolen, blood spilled in the name of greed. Ethan had ignored it, like he ignored most things now. Yet something gnawed at him, an itch between his shoulders that told him trouble was riding close. He adjusted the rifle strap across his back and set his jaw. The wind shifted, carrying a faint smell of blood. Ethan stopped cold. It was fresh, metallic, riding on the air like a warning. He narrowed his eyes toward the trail leading south. The vultures had begun to descend, black shapes folding like knives against the burning sky. He sighed through his teeth, muttering to no one, "Not today." But his horse snorted, ears pricked, as if to say trouble wasn't asking for permission. Ethan swung into the saddle and turned toward the dark shapes on the horizon. Whatever was waiting there, it wasn't going to be pretty. He could already feel the weight of it, heavy and unshakable, like the first shadow of a storm rolling in. The desert had a way of calling men to their fate, And Ethan, whether he liked it or not, was about to answer. Ethan guided his horse toward the vultures, each hoofbeat sinking into the parched earth with a hollow sound. The trail narrowed between two limestone ridges, their edges sharp and jagged like teeth. The smell of blood grew stronger. He felt his hand slip to the revolver at his hip, though he doubted whatever lay ahead would require a bullet. Then he saw it. At first, it looked like a trick of the desert, a dark shape against the burning glare, motionless. But as he rode closer, the shape resolved into something human. His gut tightened. A girl. She was bound upright against a towering mescalero cactus, arms tied with rawhide so tight her wrists were purple. Her head slumped to one side, black hair matted with sweat and blood, her breathing so faint he almost thought she was gone. The cactus thorns had pierced through her tunic, pinning her like some cruel, living crucifix. Beneath her feet, the sand was stained dark. A weathered sign, nailed to a piece of mesquite wood, leaned crookedly nearby. Scrawled in dried blood were the words, "Betrayer, last of the Dawn Children." Ethan's breath caught in his throat. It wasn't cavalry riding. No, this was older, angrier, a tribal warning. He dismounted slowly, his boots crunching over gravel. The heat pressed down like an iron hand. He crouched near the girl, studying her face. High cheekbones, bronze skin, and a strength even in her stillness. She looked young, too young to be carrying such scars. He reached out, almost afraid she'd crumble under his touch, and brushed her hair back from her face. Her lips were cracked, and her skin burned hot beneath the sun. "Damn it," he muttered under his breath. For a moment he hesitated. He knew better than to get involved. This was Apache land, and a white man meddling here rarely walked away with his life. Whoever did this might be watching from the rocks, waiting for a reason to shoot. He stood there, torn between instinct and conscience. His mind screamed at him to walk away. Let her be. This wasn't his fight. But then her eyes fluttered open. Dark and sharp, like polished obsidian, they locked onto his. There was no plea, no desperation, just something quiet, unyielding. And in that gaze, Ethan saw another face, smaller, innocent, the little boy he hadn't saved during the burning of that Apache village years ago. That memory slammed into him like a bullet to the gut. He drew his Bowie knife without another thought. "Easy now," he said, his voice rough but steady. "I'm not here to hurt you." The girl didn't flinch as he cut the rawhide bindings. Her knees buckled, but Ethan caught her before she hit the sand. She weighed almost nothing, a feather of blood and bone. "Water," he said, fumbling for his canteen. He tilted it against her lips. She swallowed, slow and painful, but kept her eyes on him, as if weighing his soul. "Name?" he asked quietly. She didn't answer. "All right," he sighed. "We'll talk later." He glanced around. Boot prints in the sand. 5, maybe 6 men, cavalry-issue boots. They'd been here not long ago. 2 hours at most. Trouble was coming. He tore a sleeve from his shirt and carefully wrapped it around her shoulder where cactus thorns still clung. As he worked, he noticed a necklace tucked beneath her torn tunic, a turquoise pendant carved into the shape of a heart, etched with ancient symbols. The heart of the mountain. Ethan had heard whispers of it before. A relic, a key, something both sacred and dangerous. He didn't know the truth, but the way her fingers tightened around it told him it was worth dying for. He met her gaze once more, softer this time. "You're safe now. I'll see to that," he said, though he wasn't sure if he believed it himself. The desert wind rose suddenly, stirring the dust at their feet. Somewhere beyond the ridge, a thin column of smoke curled into the sky. A signal. Ethan felt the old weight settle on his shoulders, heavier than his rifle, heavier than his guilt. By cutting those ropes, he knew he wasn't just freeing a girl. He was tearing open a door to a past he'd spent 10 years trying to bury. And there would be no turning back. If you found this helpful, a quick like really helps us keep creating. The horse's hooves beat a steady rhythm against the cracked ground, a sound that mingled with the girl's shallow breathing as Ethan guided them away from the cactus grove. Her head rested limply against his chest, hair streaked with blood and dust. Every few steps, he could feel the tremor of pain that rippled through her body. He tightened his grip, not out of comfort, but to keep her from sliding off. The sun was dipping behind the jagged teeth of White Mesa, but its heat still clung like a curse. The land here had no mercy. Every stone seemed to whisper of old battles. Every gust of wind carried the taste of iron and ash. Ethan glanced over his shoulder. Vultures still circled where he'd found her, black silhouettes against a fading sky, as if reluctant to give up on the promise of death. An hour later, he reined in at the mouth of an abandoned silver mine. The entrance yawned dark and silent, framed by timbers weathered to splinters. He had used this place before, a hideout when the world outside got too loud. Tonight, it would have to do. Dismounting, Ethan carried the girl inside, his boots crunching on gravel. The air was cooler in the shadows, damp with the scent of rusted ore. He laid her on an old canvas cot he'd salvaged years ago and unfastened his canteen. "Water," he muttered, tipping a slow trickle against her lips. She swallowed, but her eyes, dark and cutting, never left his face. "You're safe here," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. Her gaze flicked to the cavalry coat tied to his saddlebag just outside the cave's mouth. A shadow passed over her expression, distrust, maybe anger. "Your cavalry!" she rasped, her voice cracked and dry like the desert floor. "I was," Ethan answered, the words heavier than lead. "Not anymore." She turned her head slightly, as if that answer didn't sit well with her. He didn't blame her. Ethan crouched, digging into his saddlebag. He pulled out a ragged strip of cloth and a small tin of salve, a mix of sage and snakeweed, something he'd traded with an Apache healer years back. Carefully, he worked the thorns out of her shoulder. She flinched, but never made a sound. Tough kid, he thought. The light outside the mine was thinning fast. He paused, listening. At first, there was only the sigh of wind through the canyon. Then, faint but unmistakable, came the distant thunder of hoofbeats. Ethan froze. He stepped to the entrance, peering out across the open plain. The horizon was fading to copper and violet, and in that dying orate he caught a glimpse, a smear of dust rising far to the north. Riders. "Damn," he muttered under his breath. He turned back to the girl. "You got a name?" She hesitated, then whispered, "Ioka." "Ethan," he replied. "Ethan Riley. And I'm guessing whoever left you out there isn't far behind." Her jaw tightened. "Blackwood," she said, almost spitting the name. The sound of that name hit Ethan like a stone to the chest. Silas Blackwood. He hadn't heard it in years, but it brought back the taste of smoke and guilt. "Rest," he said gruffly, though his mind was already racing. He moved to his gear, checking the rifle's chamber, counting bullets by touch. The hoofbeats were getting closer now. Not close enough to see, but close enough that the air felt charged. Ethan tightened his grip on the rifle. The desert was alive with danger, and Ethan knew one thing for certain. The storm he'd been avoiding all these years was finally riding his way. Night had settled over White Mesa, heavy and quiet, except for the crackle of a small fire Ethan had coaxed to life inside the mine's mouth. Shadows from the flames danced across the jagged walls, painting Ioka's face in shifting light. a face both young and ancient, carved by hardship. She sat propped against the canvas cot, a thin blanket over her shoulders, watching him with eyes that missed nothing. Ethan sat across from her, tending to his rifle. He didn't try to talk at first. She didn't strike him as the type who'd answer questions she wasn't ready to. Instead, he let the silence breathe, the sound of steel on whetstone filling the gaps. After a long moment, she spoke. "You shouldn't have cut me loose." Ethan's hand paused mid-stroke. "And leave you for the buzzards? That's not in my nature." Her gaze was sharp. "Your kind has done worse." He flinched at the words, though he couldn't deny them. "Not all of us," he muttered, but it sounded hollow even to him. He set the rifle aside and reached for the battered coffee pot on the fire. "Drink? It's rough, but it'll warm you." She took the tin cup with a nod, sipping slowly. Her hands trembled, not from weakness, but from something deeper, tension wound tight like a bowstring. Ethan caught the glint of turquoise peeking from under her blanket. "What's that?" he asked, tilting his chin toward it. Her hand instinctively covered the pendant. "It's not for you." "Didn't say it was," he replied evenly. "Just looks important." She stared into the fire, as if weighing how much to tell him. Finally, she drew the necklace out from under the fabric. The turquoise heart gleamed in the firelight, etched with intricate patterns that seemed older than the canyon walls themselves. Ethan felt something shift in the air, not superstition, but a weight, like the presence of history. "This," she said softly, "is the heart of the mountain. It belongs to my people. My father died to protect it." Ethan frowned. "Heart of the mountain? I've heard talk, thought it was just a legend." "Most legends are truths the world forgot," Ioka replied. Her fingers tightened around the stone. "It is not gold or silver. It is a key." "A key to what?" he asked. She met his gaze, and for the first time her eyes burned with something fierce. "To the spirit ground, to healing, to a power that cannot be bought or stolen. But men like Blackwood don't care. They think if they hold it, they can control us, break us." Ethan leaned back, letting her words sink in. Blackwood. The name still tasted like ash in his mouth. He remembered the way the man had smiled while villages burned. If Blackwood was after this pendant, it wasn't just greed. It was destruction wrapped in law and steel. "So that's why they tied you up," Ethan said. "To make an example?" "To kill the last of the Dawn children," she said. "My father was one, a healer, a guide. They call me the last because there's no one left after me." Ethan ran a hand over his jaw. "Hell," he muttered, "you've got more enemies than I thought." She gave a bitter laugh. "And you? Why help me? You wear the coat." "I used to," he said, quietly, "but I'm not proud of it." Ioka studied him for a long moment. "Then maybe," she said, "you're not like the rest." Outside, a coyote howled, a low, haunting sound that rolled across the canyon. Ethan felt the chill of it down his spine. He looked at her again, at the pendant glowing in her hand, and knew there was no walking away now. Ethan barely slept that night. The fire had burned down to embers, casting a faint red glow on the mine's walls, but his mind was far from rest. He sat just beyond the cot where Ioka lay sleeping, hunched over his rifle, running a cloth over the barrel again and again, as if the steady motion could scrub away 10 years of guilt. The name she had spoken, Blackwood, kept echoing in his head like the crack of a whip. Silas Blackwood, a man Ethan had once ridden beside, saluted, obeyed. A man who spoke of honor while his boots trampled over it. Ethan closed his eyes, and the memory came unbidden. The sky that day was a wall of smoke, black and choking. Men on horseback stormed through the village, torches in hand, their orders clear: no one leaves alive. Ethan had been younger then, the shine of his cavalry badge still fresh. He'd stood frozen as the screams rose around him, mothers clutching their children, warriors cut down before they could raise a weapon. And there was Blackwood, his saber gleaming, shouting with the zeal of a preacher, "For the Union! For order!" Blackwood's voice had been thunder, drowning out reason. Ethan hadn't fired a shot, but that was the worst part. He had done nothing, not one damn thing. The memory faded with a jolt as a gust of wind rattled the timbers above him. Ethan opened his eyes, jaw clenched so hard it ached. He looked toward Ioka, the faint rise and fall of her breath beneath the blanket. Blackwood was hunting her now, that much was certain. At dawn, Ethan saddled the horse and checked the horizon. A thin line of dust moved far off to the west, too straight, too steady to be natural. Riders, he cursed under his breath. When Ioka stirred, he handed her a strip of dried jerky and a tin cup of bitter coffee. She accepted both without thanks, her dark eyes scanning the canyon mouth. "They're coming, aren't they?" she asked. "Yeah," Ethan said, strapping on his revolver. "Blackwood's close." She didn't look surprised. "He won't stop until I'm dead." Ethan paused, watching her fingers tighten around the turquoise pendant. "What's he want with it?" "Power," she said simply. "He wants to break my people, take what's sacred and twist it. Men like him don't see spirits, only leverage." Ethan's lip curled in disgust. "That sounds about right." Ioka tilted her head, studying him. "You know him, don't you?" Ethan hesitated, then nodded. "Too well. I rode under his command once. Thought he was a soldier with principles. Turned out he was just another vulture with a badge." Her gaze softened slightly. "And now?" "Now, I owe a debt," Ethan said quietly, "to every soul I didn't save back then." Outside, the hoofbeats were closer, faint but steady, echoing off the canyon walls. Ethan grabbed his rifle and moved to the entrance of the mine, scanning the ridgeline. "They'll find this place," he muttered. "It's just a matter of time." Ioka stood, shaky but determined. "Then we don't wait. We move before they do." Ethan looked at her, impressed despite himself. This girl, this last dawn child, wasn't broken. Not yet. "Fine," he said, tightening the cinch on his saddle. "But if we're riding together, you'll need to trust me." She didn't answer, but she climbed onto the horse behind him, her hands gripping the back of his worn duster. As they rode out of the mine and into the rising sun, Ethan felt it, the old ghost stirring, the shadow of Blackwood closing in. The desert stretched wide and silent as they rode east, chasing the faint shade of a ridge before the noon sun could burn the breath out of them. Ethan's gelding moved with slow, deliberate steps, as if sensing the weight of the two riders and the burden of unspoken truths between them. Ioka sat behind him, her grip firm on the worn leather of the saddle, but her back straight, as though she refused to lean on him for support. By mid-afternoon, they stopped near a patch of mesquite and prickly pear, the only sign of life in miles of rock and dust. Ethan dismounted first, offering a hand, but Ioka ignored it, sliding down with a sharp wince. He didn't push her pride. She walked to the shade, her steps careful but steady. Ethan crouched by the fire he was coaxing to life. "You'll need to eat something," he said, placing strips of jerky and a few wild desert onions on a skillet. Ioka sat cross-legged a few feet away, her dark eyes scanning the horizon. "I eat when I need to, not because someone tells me to." Ethan gave a small, humorless grin. "Sounds like someone I know." She glanced at him, almost curious, then back to the land. "You keep looking west. You expect him to come from there?" Ethan's jaw tightened. Blackwood's a hunter. He knows how to track, how to push prey where he wants it. We'll keep moving, but I don't kid myself. He'll find us if we're sloppy." The meal was silent except for the pop of the fire. When they'd eaten, Ayoka rose and walked a few steps away, crouching by the sand. Her fingers traced a faint line along the ground, pausing where a blade of grass bent slightly. "Horse," she said. "2 riders. Passed here before the sun climbed high." Ethan frowned, impressed despite himself. "You read the land better than any man I've met." She didn't look at him. "This land speaks. You just don't listen." "Then teach me," he said, after a moment. She studied him, perhaps expecting sarcasm, but his face was steady. Without a word, she pointed at the bent grass, then at a patch of disturbed soil. The desert keeps stories. Every mark, every ripple tells you something. Men like Blackwood, they think they own the land. They don't even know how to read it. That night, after they set up camp under a sky spattered with stars, Ethan handed her his revolver. "Your turn," he said. Ayoka stared at the weapon, then at him. "I don't need your gun." "You don't," he admitted, "but if you're staying alive, knowing how to shoot won't hurt." She hesitated, then took the revolver. It was heavy in her hands, the ivory grip worn smooth by years of use. Ethan stood behind her, guiding her stance. "Feet apart, relax your shoulders. It's not about force, it's about finding stillness." Her first shot rang out, wide and off the mark, scattering dust from a rock 20 feet away. She scowled, lowering the gun. "Not bad," Ethan said. "I missed," she snapped. "Everyone does, first time," he replied. "What matters is why you missed. You're fighting the gun, not working with it." She looked at him, eyes narrowing. "And you? You always hit?" "Not always," he said, his voice softer now. "But I've learned that when you shoot with a clear heart, your aim doesn't shake." For the first time since they'd met, a hint of a smile tugged at her lips, faint but real. As the fire burned low, they sat in silence, staring at the stars. "When I was a child," Ayoka said quietly, "my father told me the stars are the footprints of those who walked before us. He said one day I would follow them." Ethan glanced at her. Sounds like he was a good man. She nodded, the firelight reflecting in her eyes. "He died because of men like Blackwood." Ethan swallowed hard, his fingers curling into fists. Then maybe it's time someone made Blackwood pay. The following morning broke with a cruel kind of quiet, the kind that told Ethan trouble was crawling closer. He woke before dawn, the embers of their fire cold and gray, and scanned the horizon with that instinct every man who's hunted or been hunted develops. The sky was pale, washed clean of stars, and the land felt tense beneath the first touch of light. Ayoka was already awake, crouched near a patch of sand where the night wind hadn't disturbed the surface. She pointed at a faint line of impressions etched into the earth. "Boot prints," she said. 4 men, maybe 5, passed through less than a day ago." Ethan knelt beside her, tracing the prints with calloused fingers. "Cavalry issue," he muttered, noting the shape and depth. "Blackwood's men." Ayoka's gaze hardened. "He's coming." Ethan stood, brushing the grit from his palms. "We need to move, fast. Once they're this close, they won't stop." They packed in silence, his movements quick, efficient, while she slung her satchel over her shoulder, her fingers never leaving the turquoise pendant. When they set off, the desert wind was rising, carrying with it the distant cry of a hawk. By mid-morning, the air grew heavy. Ethan could feel the shift in the land, not just heat, but pressure. He paused on a ridge and scanned the horizon with narrowed eyes. A faint smear of smoke was curling upward miles away, twisting in the wind like a dark finger pointing straight at them. "Signal fire," he muttered. "They're flushing us out." Ayoka looked to the smoke, then to him. "We can't outrun them, can we?" Ethan shook his head. "Not for long. They've got better horses, more men." He turned to her, voice steady. But we can outthink them. Ayoka's expression was unreadable. Or we can fight. Fight? Ethan gave a dry laugh, glancing at the rifle slung across his back. It's just me and you, girl. Blackwood's got 6 guns at least, maybe more. Then maybe it's not about who's got the most bullets, she said. Her tone was calm, but there was fire in her eyes. Maybe it's about who's willing to stand. Ethan studied her for a long moment. She wasn't just some scared fugitive. She was steel wrapped in scars. He couldn't help but respect that. They made camp in the shadow of a sandstone bluff that evening, the sky bleeding red as the sun sank behind the ridges. Ethan sat cleaning his revolver, while Ayoka sharpened a thin blade she'd pulled from her satchel. The scrape of stone on metal was sharp and steady. "You ever wonder if it's worth it?" Ethan asked, his voice low. "What?" "Fighting back, risking your neck for something you can't see or hold." Ayoka paused, looking at him. "You see this land?" she asked, sweeping her hand at the desert. "It holds the bones of my people, the songs of my ancestors. I don't fight for treasure. I fight so their voices aren't lost." Ethan nodded slowly, the weight of her words settling over him. He thought of the burned village, of faces he couldn't forget, and for the first time in years he felt the old fire stir. As night fell, they heard it, faint at first, then closer, the distant drum of hooves. Ethan rose, scanning the darkness. "They're here," he said, voice flat. "We've got maybe one night before they find this camp." Ayoka met his gaze. "Then stop running, Ethan. Face him. Face what you left behind." He looked at her, the firelight flickering across his face, and for a long moment he said nothing. Then, finally, he nodded. Ethan woke before first light, the sky still a dark canvas streaked with the faintest hints of dawn. He stood at the edge of their camp, watching the desert, feeling the heaviness of what was coming. This was no longer about running. He knew that now. Blackwood was close, too close. If they kept moving, they'd eventually be cornered. It was time to make a stand. Ayoka sat nearby, quiet and still, her blanket wrapped around her shoulders. Her eyes were closed, lips moving silently. Ethan realized she was praying, not to any god he knew, but to the spirits of her ancestors, to the land itself. The soft murmur of her voice mingled with the wind, and for a moment the desert felt alive, as though listening. When she opened her eyes, Ethan was watching her. "You talk to the land," he said softly. "I ask it to remember us," she replied, "to guide us when blood is spilled." Ethan glanced away, uncomfortable, and pulled the small silver cross from around his neck. It had been years since he'd prayed, not since the fire and smoke of that terrible day. But now, holding the cool metal between his fingers, he whispered a few words, not elegant, but raw. "Lord, I don't know if you still hear me, but if you do, give me the strength to end this the right way." By mid-morning, they were scouting a canyon east of the ridge, a narrow pass flanked by jagged walls. "Here," Ethan said, crouching to trace a rough map in the dirt, "Blackwood's men will have to come through this gap if they're tracking us. We make this ground ours." Ayoka knelt beside him, studying the lines he'd drawn. "We can use the rocks. Shadows at dusk will hide us." Ethan nodded. "We'll set snares here and here. Tripwires if we can find enough wire." He glanced at her. "You ever set a charge?" She raised an eyebrow. "Explosives?" He grinned faintly. "Leftover mining charges. They're old, but they'll do the trick." The afternoon was spent in silent labor. Ethan climbed the rocks to place the charges, while Ayoka gathered reflective shards from broken canteens they'd found near the abandoned mine. She explained her plan. When the sun dipped low,
Those shards would catch the light, blinding the riders at the right moment. When they paused to rest, Ethan handed her his revolver again. "Show me your draw." Her stance was steadier this time. The shot rang out, echoing through the canyon, and struck a weathered rock dead center. Ethan allowed himself a small, approving smile. "Not bad," he said. "You sound surprised," she replied. "Not surprised," he said, looking at her directly. "Just glad I'm not facing you." Evening came like a slow burn, the horizon painted in hues of copper and blood. As the wind picked up, Ethan and Ioka sat by a small fire, eating what might be their last meal before the storm broke.
Neither spoke for a while. The silence between them had become something more than emptiness. It was understanding. Finally, Ioka broke it. "When this is done, will you walk away again from all this?" Ethan shook his head, staring into the fire. "Not this time. I'm tired of running, tired of being the man who does nothing." She nodded, as if that answer mattered more than he knew. As night fell, Ethan lay awake, listening to the whisper of the wind through the canyon. In his gut, he felt it. Tomorrow, everything would come to a head, and by dusk, either they would stand victorious, or their bones would join the desert. If you're still watching right now, drop a 1 in the comments so I know you're still with me on this journey. The sun was bleeding out across White Mesa, staining the canyon walls in molten red. Every shadow looked sharper, every gust of wind heavier with dust and tension. Ethan crouched behind a jagged outcrop, rifle pressed against his shoulder, breath slow and measured. Beside him, Ioka knelt low, the turquoise pendant tucked safely under her shirt, her dark eyes reflecting the fiery sky. "They'll come through the pass," Ethan whispered, eyes fixed on the narrow gorge below. "When the lead rider hits that marker, I take the first shot." Ioka nodded, her hand resting lightly on the revolver he'd given her. Her face was calm, but Ethan could sense her pulse racing, or maybe it was his own. Then the hoofbeats came, slow at first, then pounding louder as Blackwood's men rode into the gorge. Dust curled around them, swallowing their figures in a haze of gold and crimson. The trap Ethan had set, snare lines stretched between rocks, reflective shards positioned to catch the fading sun, was waiting like a coiled snake. The first rider broke through the shadows. A flash of sunlight from Ioka's mirror shard caught his eyes, startling the horse. It reared violently, throwing the rider off balance just as Ethan's rifle cracked. The shot echoed like thunder, and the man fell hard, rolling into the dust. Chaos erupted. Blackwood's voice barked orders somewhere behind the line. Another rider galloped forward, but his horse tripped the snare wire, sending him tumbling head-first into the rock-strewn ground. Ioka fired her revolver. The shot rang true, forcing a third rider to duck for cover behind a boulder. Bullets zipped through the canyon, sparks flaring as lead met stone. "Keep your head down," Ethan growled, working the lever of his rifle. He fired again, dropping another man from his saddle. Blackwood himself hadn't shown yet. Ethan scanned the dust, the fire in his chest building. He knew the man. The snake wouldn't risk the front line. No, Blackwood would wait until his prey was exhausted, then strike where it hurt most. "Ethan!" Ioka shouted, pointing to the ridge on the left. 2 men were circling to flank them. "Not today," he muttered, grabbing the last mining charge and hurling it down toward the ridge's base. The explosion ripped through the silence, shaking the ground and scattering both riders in a storm of dirt and fire. When the dust settled, the canyon fell eerily quiet, broken only by the groans of Blackwood's wounded men. Ethan tightened his grip on the rifle, scanning for the shadow he knew was coming.
Blackwood was out there, and this was just the beginning. The canyon had gone quiet, but Ethan knew better than to trust silence. He reloaded quickly, eyes scanning the broken terrain. The wounded groans of Blackwood's men drifted on the wind, but the commander himself was nowhere to be seen. That meant trouble. Blackwood was a predator who thrived in the blind spots. A flicker of movement near the canyon edge caught Ethan's eye. Too late. A shadow slipped past the chaos, cutting toward the abandoned mine where Ioka had taken cover. Ethan's gut clenched. Damn it! He sprinted down the slope, boots grinding against loose gravel. Inside the mine, Ioka gripped the revolver with both hands, every muscle tense. She had heard the footsteps before seeing him. Silas Blackwood stepped from the darkness like a ghost dressed in steel. His coat, though smeared with dust, still carried the shine of authority. The bone-white gloves on his hands seemed almost theatrical, but his eyes, cold, gray, merciless, were the true weapons. "Well, well," he drawled, his voice slick with mockery. "The last dawn, child. I was wondering when I'd get the pleasure." "Stay back," Ioka said, the revolver steady, though her heart pounded like a war drum. Blackwood smirked, raising his hand slightly, but not stepping back.
"Do you even know why they call you that? Do you know what your father did to keep you alive?" Ioka froze. "What are you talking about?" "Oh, he was a brave one, I'll give him that," Blackwood continued, his voice low, cutting. "But when faced with the fire, he broke. He gave me names, villages, lives. He bartered his own people for you, for this." He gestured to the turquoise pendant hanging from her neck. Her breath caught, rage and confusion colliding. "You're lying." "Am I?" His eyes glinted with cruel amusement. 3 settlements burned because of him. And you're the survivor, the prize. Tell me, girl, how does it feel to know your father's love cost the lives of so many? Her grip on the revolver trembled. For a moment, the words burrowed under her skin, threatening to crack the foundation of everything she believed. Blackwood took a slow step closer, his voice a poisonous whisper. "You were never meant to carry that pendant. You're not the savior they think you are. You're the reason they're gone." Ioka's breath hitched, and that hesitation was all he needed. Blackwood lunged forward, knocking the gun from her hand as the chamber echoed with the sound of boots pounding toward them. Ethan was coming. The revolver clattered across the stone floor, skidding into the shadows. Ioka stumbled back, her shoulder slamming against the jagged wall of the mine. Blackwood loomed over her, his smirk a cruel crescent beneath the brim of his hat. The dust of the canyon still clung to his coat, but his presence radiated something far darker. Control, the kind that crushed spirits long before it broke bones. "Do you understand now?" he hissed, voice dripping with venom. "Your father wasn't a hero. He was a coward who sold his own people to save one girl. You." The words cut deeper than any blade. Ioka's knees buckled, the weight of doubt pressing her down. Could it be true? Had every story, every prayer her father whispered been a lie, bought with the blood of innocence? Her hand trembled as it touched the turquoise pendant at her throat. It suddenly felt heavier, almost burning against her skin. "Was I worth all their deaths?" she whispered, more to herself than to him. Blackwood's grin widened, sensing the crack in her armor. "No, you were never worth it. But maybe I can still make something useful out of you. Hand over the heart, and maybe I'll let you live long enough to find out what real loyalty looks like." "Don't listen to him!" Ethan's voice roared from the mine's entrance. He stood there, blood streaking his left arm from a grazing bullet wound, his rifle aimed steady despite the pain. "He's twisting the truth. It's what he's always done." Blackwood turned slightly, though he didn't retreat. "Ah, Riley," he sneered, "still playing the savior? You're as guilty as I am. You watched those fires burn, didn't you?" Ethan's jaw tightened. "Yeah, and I've carried those flames every damn day since. But I won't let you snuff out what's left of her hope." He looked at Ioka then, really looked, past the dust and the fear, into the storm brewing in her eyes. "Listen to me," he said, voice low but fierce. "A father's love is never betrayal. He didn't give you life so you'd doubt it. He gave it so you'd carry it forward." Ioka's breath caught, her fingers clutching the pendant tighter. Something shifted inside her, a spark breaking through the fog of doubt. Blackwood saw it too, and his smirk faltered. "You don't own me," she said, her voice steadier now, "and you'll never own this." Blackwood's hand shot out, aiming to seize the pendant, but Ioka moved with a sudden burst of fury. She ducked low, twisting from his grip, her hand sweeping across the floor until her fingers closed around a jagged stone. She swung upward, slamming it into his wrist. He snarled in pain, stumbling back. Ethan didn't hesitate. He fired a warning shot that sparked against the cave wall inches from Blackwood's shoulder. "Step away, Silas," he growled. "You're not walking out of here with her." But Blackwood was quicker than a rattlesnake. He pivoted and fired. The bullet grazed Ethan's ribs, knocking him against the mine's timber post with a grunt of pain. Blood soaked through his shirt instantly. "Ethan!" Ioka cried, but he lifted his hand, motioning her to stay back. "I'm fine," he said through gritted teeth. His breath was heavy, but his stance remained unshaken. "I've had worse." Blackwood advanced, his revolver leveled. "You should have stayed on the ranch, Riley. You were never cut out for heroics." Ethan's lips curled into a grim smile. "Funny. I thought the same about you. Never cut out to be a man." That was enough to draw Blackwood's rage. He charged. Ethan sidestepped, the motion almost costing him his balance as pain ripped through his side. Ioka seized the chance. With a sharp whistle, the same whistle she used to signal hawks in the canyon, she lunged for the revolver lying on the floor. Blackwood spun toward her, but Ethan slammed his shoulder into the man, driving him into the mine wall with a crash that sent dust raining from the ceiling. "Now, girl!" Ethan barked. Ioka fired. The shot struck Blackwood's hand, sending his weapon spinning across the dirt. He roared, clutching his bleeding knuckles, fury burning in his eyes. Breathing hard, Ethan leveled his rifle again. His arm trembled from blood loss, but his voice was steady. "It's over, Silas. No more running. No more fires." For a heartbeat, the cave went silent except for the echo of their ragged breaths. Ioka stood beside Ethan now, revolver steady in her grip. The two of them, a broken soldier and the last dawn child, had become an unshakable wall. Blackwood glanced between them, his sneer fading as he realized the tide had turned. The sound of hooves cut through the tense silence, echoing down the canyon like a distant drum. Ethan froze, listening. This wasn't Blackwood's men. The rhythm was steadier, heavier. He recognized the pattern, the disciplined trot of lawman. A faint whistle, sharp and deliberate, followed by the crack of a signal shot. Ethan exhaled. "That'll be Red Hill," he muttered. Blackwood's eyes narrowed. "You called the sheriff? You think that old fool will save you?" He laughed, bitter and sharp. "This is the frontier, Riley. Out here, law is just the name of the man holding the gun." "Then maybe it's time you handed yours over," Ethan replied, voice low but solid. The clatter of boots and spurs filled the air as Sheriff Otis Redhill rode into view, flanked by 2 deputies. The grizzled old lawman dismounted with surprising grace for his age, his hand resting casually on the butt of his Colt. His sharp gaze swept the scene. Ethan, bleeding but upright, Ioka standing firm, and Blackwood cornered like a wolf in a trap. "Silas Blackwood," the sheriff drawled, his tone like gravel. "You're under arrest for murder, arson, and a list of sins too long to read before supper." Blackwood's sneer deepened. "Otis, you can't be serious. I am the law out here." "Not today, you ain't," Otis replied, stepping closer. "Drop the weapon." Blackwood hesitated, his hand twitching near the revolver at his belt. For a heartbeat, Ethan thought he might make a suicidal play. He raised his rifle, ready to end it. "Do it," Blackwood hissed at him, almost daring Ethan. "You know you want to. One shot, and you can bury your guilt with me." Ethan's finger tightened on the trigger, but then he shook his head. "No. I'm done letting hate decide who I am. Justice belongs to God, and maybe a good sheriff." With a growl, Blackwood dropped his weapon. Otis's deputies moved in, slapping iron cuffs onto his wrists. "About damn time," the sheriff muttered, tipping his hat to Ethan. "You look like hell, Riley." "Feel worse," Ethan replied with a grim smile. "But we're not done yet." Ioka said nothing, but the fire in her eyes burned brighter than ever. Blackwood was defeated, but there was still one final thing to do. The canyon was quiet after the sheriff's men led Blackwood away, his curses fading into the distance like the last echo of a storm. Ethan sat on a flat rock near the mine entrance, pressing a rag against his wound. Every muscle in his body screamed, but for the first time in years, the weight on his chest felt lighter. Ioka stood a few steps away, holding the turquoise pendant in her hands. The setting sun bathed her in warm gold, making the stone glow as if it carried its own fire. She looked down at it, her face unreadable. "Your father kept this safe," Ethan said softly, breaking the silence. "Not because he was weak, but because he believed in you." She turned, her eyes meeting his. "And if Blackwood was right? If his deal cost lives?" Ethan shook his head. "Love costs, Ioka. It always does. But a man who risks everything to save his child, that's not betrayal. That's the purest kind of courage." For a long moment, neither spoke. Then Ioka walked toward a lone juniper tree standing crooked against the fading light. Its roots clung to the hard desert soil, stubborn and unyielding, a survivor, just like her. She knelt at its base and began to dig with her hands. Ethan wanted to help but stayed back, watching her every motion. When the hole was deep enough, she wrapped the heart of the mountain in a strip of cloth embroidered with Apache symbols, patterns that spoke of life, fire, and sky. "This doesn't belong to me," she said quietly, placing it into the earth. "It belongs here, to the land, to the spirits, to all who came before." The moment she pressed the last handful of soil over it, the wind shifted. A warm breeze swept across the mesa, carrying the scent of sage and rain, as if the land itself exhaled. Ethan limped over, resting a hand on the tree's rough bark. "Feels like it's finally over." Ioka shook her head, a small but determined smile on her lips. No, this is just where the healing begins. They stood together as the first stars appeared, the silence between them no longer heavy but calm, the kind of silence that comes when the ghosts of the past finally let go. If you like this video, please comment number 9. If you don't like it, please comment number 0. The desert had a different voice now. It no longer whispered of ghosts or old regrets, but hummed softly with the sounds of life returning. Juniper Hollow, once a stretch of barren earth and broken fences, was slowly becoming something new under Ethan's calloused hands and Ioka's quiet determination. The early morning sun spilled over the ridges, painting the land in shades of gold. Ethan stood by the corral, hammering a new plank into place. His broad shoulders moved with a deliberate rhythm. Thud, pause, thud, as if each nail was another memory being set to rest. Just beyond him, Ioka knelt in the loose soil, planting the roots of young yucca plants. She worked with an attentiveness that felt sacred, as if every seed she pressed into the earth was part prayer, part promise. "Yucca grows stubborn," she said, brushing her hands against her skirt. "Like our people. Once it takes hold, it doesn't let go." Ethan leaned on the fence, wiping sweat from his brow. "Sounds like someone I know," he replied, his voice carrying the faintest smile. The ranch wasn't much yet. A half-repaired barn, a few strong posts, and a modest patch of cultivated ground. But to Ethan, it was a kingdom compared to the hollow silence he'd carried for years. Each day brought new purpose, tending to the horses, fixing the windmill, hauling water. He was no longer a man riding alone into empty sunsets. Ioka had transformed the old barn into a place of healing. Shelves lined with jars of herbs, wild sage, willow bark, and snakeweed filled the space with an earthy fragrance. Travelers passing through the desert, often sunburned and half-starved, would stop by for rest, and Ioka would treat their wounds while Ethan found them a meal. One afternoon, a group of children from a nearby Apache camp wandered to the ranch. Their laughter rang bright against the quiet mesa. Ioka sat them under the shade of the lone juniper tree, telling stories of the dawn children, tales of the stars, the mountains, and the heart of the earth. Ethan watched from the porch, leaning against the railing, his rifle set aside for once. Later that evening, as the sun bled orange over the horizon, Ethan pulled out something he hadn't touched in years, an old guitar with worn strings. He sat on the porch steps, plucking at the chords. The first notes were rough, but soon a melody rose, slow and tender, floating over the desert wind. Ioka stepped out from the barn, wiping her hands on her skirt, and paused to listen. "I didn't know you played," she said softly. "I didn't think I still could," Ethan admitted, his voice carrying a strange mix of pride and sorrow. "I stopped the day they burned Clearwater. Felt like I didn't deserve music anymore." She looked at him for a long moment, then sat down beside him on the step. "Maybe you do now," she said. For the first time in years, Ethan felt the weight of silence lift. The melody grew stronger under his hands, and as the stars began to show, the ranch glowed with a kind of peace he'd thought he'd never know again. That night, after the children left and the fire in the barn's hearth burned low, Ethan and Ioka stood under the juniper tree. The land felt alive beneath their feet, pulsing with a quiet strength. "This place," Ethan said, gazing out over the darkening horizon, "it feels like it's starting to breathe again." Ioka nodded. "So are we." A thin layer of morning mist clung to Juniper Hollow, softening the jagged edges of the desert. Ethan stood by the corral, checking the horses as the first light crept over the ridges. He was feeding the Appaloosa when he heard Ioka's voice behind him. "There's a letter," she said, holding up an envelope stamped with an official seal. Ethan raised an eyebrow, wiping his hands on a rag before taking it. He broke the seal carefully, as though the paper might crumble in his rough hands.
His eyes moved over the words, his face unreadable. "What is it?" Ioka asked, her tone cautious. Ethan looked up, a slow smile tugging at his lips. "It's from the Bureau of Western Affairs. Says Juniper Hollow is now officially recognized as an Apache heritage site." He paused, glancing at her. "This land, it's protected now, yours and your people's." For a moment, Ioka didn't move. Then she stepped closer, taking the letter as if to confirm it herself. The morning light caught her face, and Ethan saw the shimmer in her eyes. "They remembered," she whispered. "For once, they listened." Ethan nodded. "It's about damn time." They walked together to the old juniper tree where the heart of the mountain lay buried. Ioka knelt, pressing her hand to the earth. "Father," she murmured in Apache, "your stories are safe here."
The land remembers. Ethan stood behind her, silent, his hat in hand. In that moment, he realized he wasn't just standing on land. He was standing on history, hers, his, and something larger than both of them. Later that day, the ranch was alive with visitors. A group of elders from the Apache camp arrived, bringing gifts, hand-woven blankets, dried herbs, and carved talismans. They spoke with Ioka for hours, sharing stories and prayers. Ethan mostly listened, leaning against the porch post, letting the cadence of their language wash over him like a hymn. As the sun dipped low, the air grew golden and still. Ethan walked to the barn and found Ioka brushing one of the horses, her fingers gentle on its dark mane. "You thinkin' of riding out?" he asked. She looked at him, then at the horizon. "Yes, there are other villages, other children. Some are still lost." Ethan tightened the saddle strap on his horse. "Then we'll go, together." "Are you sure?" she asked, her tone half teasing. "You're not tired of chasing trouble?" He chuckled, though his voice was soft. "We're not chasing trouble. We're chasing hope. Feels different." The next morning, just as the first streaks of dawn painted the sky in fire and rose, they rode out. Dust curled beneath the hooves of their horses, trailing behind them like a ribbon of memory. Ethan glanced at Ioka. She sat tall in the saddle, her shawl fluttering in the wind, the strength of her ancestors etched in every line of her face. For the first time in years, he felt not just alive, but purposeful. As they crested a ridge, the land stretched endlessly ahead, red mesas, winding rivers, and distant canyons whispering of stories yet untold. Ethan slowed his horse just enough to take it in, to let the quiet of the moment settle deep in his bones. "You know," he said, breaking the silence, "I used to think the West was all dust and ghosts. Now," he looked at her, "now I see light." Ioka didn't answer, but the faint smile she gave him said everything. Together they rode on, two souls bound by redemption, the rising sun casting long, golden shadows behind them. This is just one of our true Wild West stories, where grit meets grace and echoes of the past touch the soul. If these tales stir memories of simpler times, loyalty, and unspoken courage, join our series. Ride with us through the heart of the West and feel its timeless spirit.